And welcome to an unplanned edition of Ben's Junk. In that I had no intentions of covering this one, largely because there are already a good 100 videos on this on YouTube alone, most of which are made by people with a better understanding and far more expertise with synthesizers than I have. But between the last Ben's Junk I did back in September on that cheap theremin, in which this guy was sitting in the background, plus the likely reaction to the incidental music in last week's Halloween special, which, full disclosure, hasn't dropped yet as of my shooting this, I'm getting slash anticipating enough people noticing and asking questions that I guess I'll just try and cover it after all. Now, let me tell you up front, this is going to be a very talky Ben's Junk, so if you're not into that, you might just want to stop right now. But anyway, for those of you brave enough to soldier on with me, yes, this is indeed a realistic Concertmate MG-1 synthesizer made by Moog Music for Radio Shack in, I believe, only 1981 and 82. I think this is an 82 model. And these things sold for, I believe, $500 at the time. And yes, I said Moog because that's how Bob Moog, the inventor of the Moog synthesizer, pronounced both his name and his product. Uh, well, that and my old electronic music slash synthesis teacher would probably hunt me down and kick my ass if I said Moog, even though it's a lot more fun to say Moog. But anyway, in case you're not privy to how Radio Shack did business back in its heyday, they would not allow anything that did not have a Radio Shack brand name prominently placed on it. And so, as such, even though Tandy Radio Shack didn't do much of its own manufacturing, you still wound up with an officially Radio Shack product. So, in this case, we're talking realistic. I admit I have never been much of a synth person, but I listened to so much classic rock growing up that I got a good earful of Moog synthesizer. And when I started in earnest trying to write songs slash make records when I was 15, I really liked that sound and I wanted to be able to use it. And I'm talking about that classic, buzzy, stereotypical sawtooth sound. And I found a setting like that on my Yamaha keyboard, and a couple of times I tried to emulate a Moog, but I never really found much of a use for that sound. And of course, it's not the most versatile sound either, so I just never pursued it again. But nevertheless, years later, during that gap between my stopping making music and starting making Oddity Archive, I found this guy at a used shop for, I think, just a bit south of $200. And you just don't turn down a Moog synthesizer, especially at that price. So even though I had no plans of making any new music, I busted out the credit card right then and there and took this sucker home. And then I started reading about this online, and I found that this particular model is legendary for having this foam padding underneath the keys, which almost always turns to goo within 10 to 15 years. So we were already well past that, even back then. So I thought, oh, great. I wound up partially dismantling this, expecting a complete disaster in there, only to find that somebody had already fixed it up, already got all the foam out, and that explained the chewed up knobs. I know you probably can't tell from the camera distance, but just trust me, the knobs are totally chewed on this thing. And I also didn't realize initially that these are not the original sliders. Imagine that. Little rubber nubby sliders not being original. Who'd have thunk it? But having said that, when I brought this back out recently, it was in real good working order when I packed it away way back when. But it, of course, it had developed some new gremlins. Most notably, it had developed some grindy noises, some oxidization in especially the sliders. So I had to give it actually a couple of good doses of deoxit. And even then, it's still not perfect. It still kind of belches on me a little sometimes when I'm moving the sliders. But anyway, jumping back to when I first got this, by that point I was a little hipper to what a Moog could slash should do than I had been at 15, but I still had no idea how to arrive at any of those sounds. And in the end, I fiddled around with this for a while and I just never got anywhere with it. And I didn't understand what any of this stuff meant, and it just intimidated the hell out of me. I mean, I could make that classic buzz sound that I mentioned, the sawtooth sound, but that seemed to be about it. And I also really hated that I had to tune a synthesizer. To me, that just didn't make sense. But I've learned since then that a lot of early synthesizers had to be tuned. So, yeah, tells you what I knew. And so it just got packed away, and for the most part, I forgot I even had it. And when I would remember it, I would just snap right back to that intimidation thing. Oh God, I don't know what to do with it. It's too techy for me. But anyway, more recently, as my regular viewers are well aware by now, I've been wanting to make some incidental music for archive. Ideally, one song for each time period from the probably 60s to 90s. So I'd say about 65 to 95 would be about right for most of archive. So naturally, I dug out the old MG-1 so it could represent the 70s and early 80s, and I figured, well, I stink at it, but I can make a few noises out of it. I'll just do that. I'll use it for a little color here and there. But having said all that, let's take a cut here and let's make some noise. I found in playing with this thing again that I seem to have gotten a little better at coming up with sounds and kinda sorta understanding what each slider slash switch slash knob does. But really, the biggest roadblock for me mentally, aside from the intimidation thing, is that for all intents and purposes, the MG-1 is a monophonic synth. Read, you can only play one note at a time. And as someone who's primarily a guitar player, I'm used to having up to, I guess, 6 notes at a time, or 12 if it's a 12 string. So anyway, there is a polyphony slider on here. I've got it all the way up, or polyphony mode, whatever you want to call it. And that allows you to play chords and stuff. But just on its own, it's kind of that toy organ sound. It's kind of vanilla. Now, you can get some pretty far out sounds from this thing in monophonic mode, but you get impeded somewhat when you're doing the poly thing. So really, I'll just kind of show you what I can kind of do. I can kind of color the sound a bit. Got a little filter effect on it there. We'll sync the oscillators. So, yeah, you can spice it up to a point, but like I said, the real fun of it is in monophonic mode, so we'll just stick with that. Now, once again, I know I'm belaboring this point, but I am not an expert. Synths are a very deep topic, and I just know I'm not going to do it justice, especially in a single Ben's Junk video. So as such, as far as the MG-1 goes, I just want to show you some of my basic personal favorite sounds and things that I've stumbled onto to date. People who are really experienced with this are probably just going to laugh their heads off through this whole thing. But yeah, let's just do some general sounds. So let's start with that classic stereotypical Moog sawtooth buzz sound, and which I consider to be the world's most perfect synth sound. So I've got the cutoff down here, so it's completely quiet right now. This way we can give it a nice, cool, dramatic entrance. So here we go. But of course, as is, you can only do kind of staccato stuff with it. It's pretty dry. So we'll add to that a bit. So up here we've got the contour section, and we got a couple of sliders, one for attack time and one for decay time, so we can shape the sound a bit. So we'll give it a little attack and a little more decay. Of course, it would help if I put it into contour mode, wouldn't it? And if I need to, hold a note, there's this handy dandy sustain switch here, which allows me to hang on to a note as long as I want and keep the attack and delay intact. And of course, I can drag this out to just ludicrous lengths. I think the decay time is like 20 seconds when it's all the way up. It just goes on forever. And it'll still be ringing out next week. So we got that, but let's rein this in a bit. All right, so let's do some of that, I guess you could say that late 60s, early 70s sound that you kind of heard in some of those commercials that used early synths. So let's see what happens when I do something like this. That decay time really helps. All right, so that's one of my favorite sounds with that. And of course, you can't do Moog without giving a little nod to Keith Emerson. So let's come out of this mode. We'll turn up the glide just a bit and we'll try and do that Lucky Man thing. I don't know what the exact note is, but the idea should be there. Of course, that's not high and annoying enough, so we'll crank the octaves as high as they go, and all right, so yeah, had to do that. All right, and of course, since this thing is very much a product of the Atari era, we got to do some square stuff. Got some definite Atari era video game music going on there. Of course, I can't really play anything from this angle, so I'm just kind of hacking away, see what I get. All right, so we got that. I'll turn this off. And actually, one more thing. Since it does sound a little wonky in square mode, you can make the two oscillators sync together so it's more stable. But anyway, I wanted to move on to this section. We've already looked at glide, but this part of the keyboard, or just I guess you could say the board in general, lets you get as close as you're going to out of this to sequencing and to bending notes. So let's start by bending notes. We'll do that with this tone sources slider. We'll crank that up and... But that's a little slow and a little woozy. Although I guess you could do a siren of sorts. So let's speed that up here. And you can, of course, get up into some more extreme areas. The laser shooter sound. But what I really like about this section is I've got this little trigger switch here that will latch onto the last note I played, and it'll just run with it. Give it a little effect. But better than that is you got to be able to do the stereotypical robot sound. So let's do that. We got a little switch here for the wave shape. We'll see what we get here. Sounds like something out of a game show. No whammies. And of course, you can make it kind of freak out on you. And the computer just exploded. All right, so coming out of that, you can also use this as a white noise generator, and I found that I really like that. So we'll jump back to this section. We'll go to continuous, so it just holds a note indefinitely, although since it's white noise, it doesn't matter what note it is, it's going to be the same no matter what. So let's just see what it gives me. I can do some whooshing, stormy effects. So kind of a windstorm sort of thing there. And go into straight up ambient territory. But in playing with this, I've been wanting to do more percussion stuff, or at least percussive. And so I got to show you my snare. I call it my Betty Davis Eyes snare, if you know that tune, the Kim Carnes version at least. So we will get back into contoured mode. We'll have no attack, just a bit of decay, and we can do a snare. Although that's a little closer to a gunshot, isn't it? We'll give it a little more decay. Yeah, you can do a good 80s trash snare. So that's cool. Or go more, I guess, into Phil Spector territory. Albeit it's a little more futuristic. Or maybe a better thing would be like maybe something like Prince used to do. Again, doesn't matter what note I hit. So I'm sure you'd like to hear something a little more traditionally musical from me here. So, to close things out today, I want to play a bit of some of the incidental music that I introduced last week. Really reprise it, I guess, at this point, since it's been such a short time. I spent way too long on this piece, but I really wanted to see if I could create a piece of music using no other instruments aside from the MG-1. And since I, shock of shocks, seem to mostly get late 70s, early 80s sounds out of this thing, I decided to shoot for some of that pseudo futuristic electronic stuff that was used by TV stations, especially pay TV stations, for filler music back then. Of course, this being archive, I had to do something that was just a teeny bit more sinister. Now, I admit the bass and drums on my track were sampled and looped by me, so it's still all mine, and I still actually played it at one point. But really, most everything was played by me in real time. This predates MIDI, so I can't really fudge individual notes too easily in Pro Tools in my case. And so, really, I guess the only other bit of cheating I did, if you can call it that, is since there's no real sequencer in here, one that you have much of any control over, I had some stuff that I wanted to sound like a sequencer, so I had to play it. And when I got a good take, I wound up cutting and pasting it so I could reuse it and keep it good and consistent. Because I know I will never in a million years get a perfect duplicate of a performance. But anyway, let's close on an excerpt of a little thing that I call Telesound 13. And I actually think it turned out pretty good. But otherwise, that is it for today, or tonight. It's actually getting kind of late here. I'll talk to you again soon.